All right, Dean, Sear Performance. We're back on the 33, kind of where I left off. Was pulling the motor and everything, and then I came back down kind of day 3, I guess you can kind of say. And like I said in the last video, I got the front axle all out. Loose springs broke. We already talked about all that. And then I went and got the original cross member out. So what I did was I took the angle grinder with like a flap disc, a good flap disc, and ground down the head of the rivets. There's 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom. Ground them down. Then I just took the air chisel and punched the rivets out of the frame, both sides. Obviously I can't stretch the frame to get the cross member out. I can't really twist the cross member out. There's a lot of boxing that was already done on the frame previously. So what I did was I took and I cut the cross member into 3 pieces. I cut the center out right here. I cut the center out, dropped that out, and then the driver's side was pretty easy to get out. You can see where the rivets were on the top and the bottom. But on the passenger side, being that what they did was they took and ran the AC, discharge hose, they tucked it in the cross member, like through a hole that sat in the middle, and then went into the frame rail and then came back out up here. Same with the fuel line. They had that coming out that center hole, which I'm not really a fan of having a rubber hose just kind of crimped onto an aluminum line that has no barbs or anything like that. At least if you flare the end of the line, you can shove the rubber hose. It gives it something to bite on. This doesn't have anything on it. So again, that's probably something I'll address. And then I started cutting that plate out, and that thing is just a nightmare. Like the welds that are behind it, and I'll try and go back over there and look. The welds that are on the top of it are just massive welds. I mean, they are ridiculously too much. Not a very good welder, whoever plated this in, but it was there and it held. The really scary thing, I may have thrown it away, but you can see right here there's a hole in the frame, and that is, I'll put a couple of pictures because I don't think I kept the nut. I think I threw it away. But so this plate sits, I mean, some of it's still there. I kind of cut the center out to get to these welds, but the plate sat here, and then they had sort of a rounded over washer as a spacer, and that was welded onto the plate. And then they took a 1/4-inch nut and welded that on top of the spacer, and then the gearbox sat here. This plate came down like this. I have it over there, I'll show you. Came down like this, and they had a 1/4-inch bolt holding the top of this gearbox, and that was one thing that he had mentioned had broke a few times, and he had somebody weld it back on. Actually, here's the plate. Now you can see that hole lined up, and it actually continued all the way out to the outside of the plate right here. So for me, being that it's a steering gearbox, I would have drilled it bigger all the way through the frame, and then used a sleeve for whatever size bolt, 1/2 inch, 5/8, 7/16, whatever size bolt threads into the gearbox, because the gearbox is actually threaded in that hole. And I would have left the tube long enough to be my spacer, as well as a sleeve, kind of a crush sleeve for the frame. But that's just me. But being that they put this huge plate on, it actually blocks the leaf spring shackle from coming out. So you could never take this leaf spring shackle out, and it would make it very, very hard to replace the bushing that's inside for that factory leaf spring. So that's another thing. That'll all be gone. I did mark the center of the axle. That's my center line, and then this is the radiator cross member, I guess you can call it, or radiator shroud support, whatever you want to call it. So it kind of needs to stay in because the front grill piece bolts down to it. You can see it's bolted here and it's bolted here. So that needed to stay. So being that this bolts to the original cross member on these 4 bolts, you know, unbolting it, you can literally take this whole radiator shroud and everything out. So what I did was I made these little tabs right here, and I made 4 of them. And I thought about bolting them in, but I honestly don't think he'll ever need to take this piece out. So I'm just going to weld these tabs in. So there's one on each side, front and back. I may choose to box the back side of it, but I don't think it needs to be. But they're not bad. They look good. They're clean. So they're just tacked in right now, just in case by some freak of nature they're in the way of the cross member somehow. Maybe the upper A-arm bolt or something like that. Hopefully they're not. So yeah, so I did that. I just supported the transmission with a piece of square tube from frame rail to frame rail. What that also does too is it gives me a leveling point for the frame. And then I just, with the plasma cutter, because I had it out, this was horrible looking. That motor mount on that side, it came out and then it was jagged, like somebody had taken a cut-off wheel and just kept slicing in and only peeled a couple of pieces off. So for now, I just kind of cut the corner off, the ugly corner off, and kind of went down. And I'll take a flap wheel and I'll clean it up. I'll probably make it look more like this side here where it's kind of rolled in a little bit. I'll make that look good again. Another thing I did find was for the clutch on these, they have like ball mounts that, so there's one on each end of the sleeve. You can see it here on this end here. This is like a ball inside, so it pivots. And then this went into here, which again, I mean, just the welds are horrific. I mean, you can kind of see this big blob. Let me get the other light here. It's just a huge blob of weld on there. See, come on. Yeah, you can kind of see that. It's just a blob of weld. It's not burned into the frame. It's barely burnt into that bracket. It's 2 pieces of flat stock that they welded together and then notched. There's no weld on the inside of the piece, so you can literally, and I'll try and do this real quick, but I'd be willing to bet you could take a crescent wrench or something and just back break that off. That's how bad that weld looks on there. And then we got under here, which is going to be harder to see because of all the plasma cutting, but you can kind of see that big blob of weld right there. That was for that plate where it goes behind the leaf spring shackle, which is cool. So again, on this side, with the little brackets I made for the radiator core support. I mean, everything else looks so far is okay. The only thing I'm not a fan of is the radiator overflow tube. Comes from, that was cool, huh? Shine the light back at the camera. It comes from the radiator under the cap. The tube runs up. It's zip tied up there, and then it drooped down, and then it just kind of laid behind the block to over here. So what I'll probably end up doing with that is I'll probably end up taking it off and I'll run it down that side of the radiator, probably across the radiator support, and then I don't know about going in the frame on that one, or just maybe reutilizing a couple of holes that are tapped for the P-clamps and kind of bring it along the frame. The header sits here really tight, so I don't know that I'll be able to get it in there safe. I may have to go inside the frame. It'd be a little cleaner. Come out over here. Back there's a hole in where they left for the wiring and all that good stuff. So I can come out there and bring it back up and into this, and I'll redo this bracket. But let's see if we can break that off real quick. I just got a crescent wrench, 10-inch crescent wrench. Yeah, you can already see it. It's coming. Yeah. So you can see it's kind of bent it over already. There's not much holding it. Yep. And there it is. Well, so kind of broke it in half. Yeah, it's cool. Boy. Broke it in half, actually. So, but it did bend the whole thing off. Welds, not that good, but you know, I'll get that off, get it cleaned up. Then the other half of it, what they did, excuse me, on all of the small blocks, the big blocks, they all have a threaded hole in the side of the block right there, and that is for your ball mount. And you can see it's machined flat, has a boss machined into it, and that's where the ball screws in for that clutch and brake pivot. But what whoever did this car, whenever it was done, let's see if I can find this piece now. Bag everything up, and then you lose it. There it is. So they took a plate and they cut the ball, then they welded it to this plate that they had made. Put a huge slot in one, and then drilled out a hole for the other mount, and they screwed it to the bell housing where I would assume this bell housing to me does not look like an old bell housing, being that it has this top hole for the block mount, like you know, where it bolts to the block. That to me is more of a newer style, kind of an LS style or something. I could be wrong. I probably am wrong, but you never know.